Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airfix YouTube channel for what is quite literally our biggest ever how-to video. It's the 1:400 scale RMS Titanic gift set. The Titanic is arguably the most famous ship of all time. Built for sheer luxury back in her day, she was met with disaster when she struck an iceberg and sank in the Atlantic Ocean. This gift set represents the Titanic as she was meant to be, and the box includes a very large model kit, as well as the paints, glue and paintbrushes required to put the model together. It also comes with pre-coloured plastic parts, which help to really cut down the amount of painting involved, as this is a considerably large model kit, and painting the whole thing with a brush would be quite the task, so the pre-coloured plastic really helps keep that painting down to an absolute minimum. The box is jam-packed with plastic of varying colours, but notably the lower hull is a single piece to speed up assembly. A small plastic bag contains the Humbrol acrylic paints that we need to paint the small detail parts on this model, and there are two paintbrushes included, a large and a small, to help paint those really fine details on some of the decks. A comprehensive multi-page instruction manual is provided with a handy printed ruler to help with cutting the rigging sections, and it is essential as always that you give this a good read before you undertake your project. Taking a look at some of the pre-coloured frames with this kit, many of the small details are supplied in the colour they're meant to be on the finished model, so they require no painting at all. The gold frame includes details such as the propellers and anchors, so we don't need to paint any metallic colours, and the deck sections are supplied in a wood-coloured tan, so we don't need to paint any really large areas. The deck sections are also embossed with a floor plan and the room descriptions for each room, which might come in really handy if you're planning on going the extra mile and doing some scratch building to create the interior of your Titanic model. As always, the toolkit that we'll be using in this video is really simple. We have a pair of cutters for removing parts from the frame, a modelling knife with a nice fresh blade for general cutting and trimming purposes, a file to remove any excess plastic from parts to ensure they fit perfectly, and a pair of tweezers to help with small details and with the rigging. We also have one of the Humbrol sanding blocks, which has a 600 and a 1000 grit surface on each side. We'll be using this to complement the file, as we want to be able to remove plastic but leave the surface as smooth as possible. This will help polish the surface back to a good finish, as we're not going to be painting most of the parts. On each frame there's a large rectangular tab with a moulded letter, and next to each part there's a small tab which is moulded with a number. This combination of letter and number is referenced in the circular callouts in the instructions and helps us to pick the correct parts for each step. We've identified the parts we need for stage 1, so we're cutting the connection points on the frame using the cutters. Even though we're cutting quite close to the surface of the part, there's still a bit of excess plastic left behind, and we'll trim this away with the modelling knife as flush to the model surface as possible. Any excess plastic that's left behind can then be gently filed away using the file to ensure a perfect fit. A tube of Humbrol polycement is supplied with the kit to enable assembly, so we'll add some of the glue to the relevant area and slide the first of our hull braces into place. These ensure that the hull does not warp, so that the decks fit on there properly, and we'll secure them with a bit of household masking tape to hold everything nice and tight until the glue takes hold. We'll repeat this all the way down the hull until all of the braces are fitted, and we'll leave the tape in place until all of the glue is cured. When it comes to the parts of the model which are visible, but not going to be painted, we need to clean them up slightly differently. After removing the excess plastic from the connection point using the file, we have to switch to the Humbrol sanding sponge using the 600 grit side first and then the 1000 grit side, just to polish away those scratches left behind by the file. Once that's complete, this part can be test fitted on the raised area on the side of the hull, before some of the supplied Humbrol polycement is added down the centre only of the raised area and in a small amount, and then the part is pushed into place. The glue control is essential, as we don't want any excess glue to bubble out onto the finished surface of our model, as we're not going to be covering this up with any paint. The propellers were cleaned up only using the modelling knife to trim away the connection point before the exposed plastic was painted in with a drop of the supplied number 54 gold. Once that was dry, a little bit of polycement on each mounting point and the propellers were glued into place. Some of the parts in this Titanic gift set are quite delicate and finely moulded, so we use the modelling knife to cut the very small connection points and provide the first stage of cleanup, as the cutters would be a bit too risky for working on very small, fragile parts such as these. The Humbrol sanding sponge was also used, as the file was a bit too rough to be removing tiny amounts of plastic. The Humbrol polycement is used in the same fashion to glue the arms of these cranes into place, and these are sub-assemblies which we'll put aside and use when called for in the instructions throughout the rest of the build. There's quite a bit of rigging to do on this model, and thread is supplied with the kit along with a small key which tells you how long to cut each piece. To help with measuring, there's also a handy ruler printed into the instructions. After measuring out the required amount of thread, we also can allow ourselves a little bit extra just to make sure we've got enough before cutting the thread with the modelling knife. This particular piece is doubled up and goes through both sides, so we'll find the midpoint by folding the thread in half and then mark it with a small piece of masking tape. After threading the doubled up rigging through the relevant hole in one of the deck sections on both sides of the model, we can pull the thread taut and then use the masking tape to help us align the rigging along the centre line of the ship. This makes sure that both sides of the rigging are the correct size. And once this is done, we can glue the thread in place using some cyanoacrylate adhesive which isn't supplied with the kit. Once this is done, all of the rigging is the same length on both sides and we can move on to the detailing. Some of the detail parts have a colour call out next to the part reference, which means they'll need to be painted before they're added to the model. The paints supplied with the kit sometimes separate while it's in storage, so we need to give them a 30-second stir just to restore the consistency of the paint, before we use the larger brush supplied with the kit to transfer some paint into a palette. Once we've done that, we can add just a few drops of ordinary tap water to improve the flow and extend the drying time of the paint. The details can be partially removed from the frame, leaving only connection points in areas which don't need to be painted, and then we can add a couple of coats of the relevant colour to the smaller details. In this case we're using number 163, which is a very dark green, and we'll do this on any of the detail parts which need this colour in large batches just to speed up the whole assembly process. After applying the paint, we allow it to dry in between coats, and once it's ready to go, we can remove that last connection point which is in an unpainted area and file away any of the excess plastic. We're now left with a fully painted detail which is ready for a small drop of polycement, and while it's being held in the tweezers, we can simply guide it into its final resting place. There are dozens of tiny details to add to the upper deck assemblies, and by painting them while still attached to the frame, it not only makes it easier to handle these smaller parts, but it also enables us to paint them fully without having to try and navigate a paintbrush at all different angles around a half-built model. After working our way through the instructions adding these details, we come across the first of our sub-assembly cranes which are required to be added. Some polycement was added inside the crane to prevent it bubbling out onto the surface of our model, and then the parts were turned to the correct alignment, referencing the colour diagrams included in the instructions to help guide us. As we approach the first of the exterior walls along the decks, we enter into a critical part of the build, as the fit of these parts is essential if we want to get a nice clean join between the three different deck layers. All of the excess plastic is removed and each of the parts is dry fitted, which means they've been fitted without any glue, to ensure that the fit is perfect before the polycement is added. After checking to make sure that everything fits properly, the glue is added but only along the inside face of the parts, so that any excess squeezes out onto the inside of the model where it won't be seen. Once the glue's been added, the first of the exterior walls is glued into place, and we can proceed through this stage of the instructions, adding all of the parts in exactly the same fashion. Some of these sections are quite long and are prone to springing out of place, so once the glue is added and the parts pushed into position, clothes pegs are used to hold the parts while the glue dries, thus making sure that they're held firmly against the deck and we get a perfect fit of the wall sections against the deck assemblies. As well as detailed parts which need to be added, some of the moulded on details on the deck sections need to be painted as well, and this is done before the build progresses too far, just so that we've got enough room to get round with the paintbrush and paint all of the different sides of the raised details. On the upper decks there are some transparent parts which need to be painted, so we roughened the surface of areas which didn't need to be transparent using the 1000 grit side of the Humbrol sanding sponge. This provides a much more favourable surface on which to paint, and there was no beading at all when applying our first coat of white. Once this was allowed to dry, a second coat was added to solidify the colour, and then we could move on to the upper surface where we needed to paint the frame around the glazing. This is provided as a raised detail, so using the smaller of the two supplied brushes, we used the side of the brush to just catch that raised plastic with the first layer of white paint. Once that was dry, we solidified the colour with a second coat of the paint, and then using a sharpened cocktail stick, we scraped away any of the acrylic which had crept onto the clear areas and brushed away any of the flakes of paint with a paintbrush. This left a really nice, sharply painted cover over the two domes on the upper deck. The next step in the instructions called for us to paint the smoke funnels with number 61 matte flesh. This was prepared in exactly the same way that we showed earlier, with a bit of additional tap water to help give it a better finish, and we used the larger of the two brushes supplied with the kit to paint the number 61 over the orange plastic. This works as a great base for the flesh colour, and we built up good coverage in just a couple of coats. Once the paint was completely dry, polycement was run around the inside perimeter of the part to prevent the glue from bubbling out, and the first of the funnels were pushed onto the locating pegs and allowed to cure. The funnels to the rear of the ship need an additional deck adding underneath, and the top of this needed to be painted before we could proceed. This was done in the same fashion that we've shown on all the other painting sequences, using slightly diluted paint to build up coverage in a couple of layers. Once the paint had been allowed to dry fully, the funnels were added to the two additional deck sub-assemblies, and then these were glued into place on the upper deck. The first funnel has an independent piece of rigging which was simply passed through the side of the part, and then glued to the inside where it wouldn't be seen using cyanoacrylate adhesive. Once this was dry, any excess thread was then snipped away using the modelling knife, and then we carried out the more complicated process of threading a longer piece of rigging in and out of the funnel, passing it through the corresponding holes on the deck each time. The tweezers were very useful for pulling the thread through the holes, and we paid careful attention to the instructions to make sure that we got the sequence correct. Once the final pass was made, the thread was pulled taut, and again we secured the rigging to the inside of the funnel where it wouldn't be seen using cyanoacrylate adhesive, and any remaining thread was trimmed away using the modelling knife. With the rigging to the funnels completed, it's time to join the decks together, and to do this we add polycement to the top of the exterior walls, concentrating the glue towards the inside of the model just so that any excess doesn't squeeze out and become visible on the finished project. Once the glue has been added, we need to move quickly to avoid it drying. The deck above is manoeuvred into position and then held for a few seconds, and if we need to, we can add some clothes pegs just to do a bit of the holding, while our hands go around and keep everything pressed together while the polycement takes effect. With the three decks joined together, we need to add the deck sides. The process is similar, and we need to concentrate the glue towards the underside again so it doesn't squeeze out and become visible. Once the glue is in place, the deck sides are added, and there are recesses moulded into this which will snap into position against the sides of the deck when it's located in the correct place. After holding for a few seconds, the polycement has taken hold, and we can flip the whole assembly over and attempt it again on the other side. We want to make sure that we don't damage any of the rigging at this point, as now the decks are joined together, we wouldn't be able to get in there to fix it. Before we can add the decks to the hull, there's some detailing to do, and this is in a very visible area of the model, so the polycement is carefully concentrated towards the inside so that we don't end up with any ugly excess glue bubbling out where it can be seen. Once the detail parts at the front and rear are added, we need to add polycement into the relevant recesses, and then the deck sections are pushed into place, taking care not to trap any of the rigging inside the model. The same process is repeated at the rear, with the larger deck section being pushed into position, and once that's fitted, we can go ahead and put the main deck assembly in place, applying glue to the guides above the hull struts that we added at the very beginning of the build. There are tabs on the deck sides which will slide into these guides, and the whole assembly can be pushed down while the polycement takes effect, and just held for a few seconds while the glue does its work. Once this large assembly is in place, all that's left to do is add the final detailing, starting with the masts at the front and rear. These need to be glued into place and checked for alignment, as these are going to be holding the rigging, and that's cut to very specific lengths, so we don't want the masts to be out of alignment, or some of the thread will be too short. Once the masts have been added, we can go ahead and start the main rigging. To attach the rigging to the masts, we used a simple overhand knot. There are some small guides moulded into the masts themselves to help with positioning, and the knot allows for correct tensioning of the thread. When it's ready to be attached, a small dot of cyanoacrylate glue is added and then the excess trimmed away. To get a better view, we tried to turn this enormous model on its side so you can see it better. Here you can see the knot being used to tension the thread correctly, and then when it's ready, a small dot of glue is being added and then the excess trimmed away. Adding rigging can be daunting, particularly for newer modelers, but it's worth the effort as the effect when finished is really quite impressive. With the masts completed, there are 16 two-part lifeboats to assemble, each of which has a small piece of thread passed through the top half and glued into place. Polycement can then be added to the lower half of the assembly, and the two pieces pressed together to create each lifeboat. Once this has been completed, the lifeboats are glued into place in the holders on the upper decks. A small drop of cyanoacrylate glue is then added to the end of each boom at either side of the lifeboat, and the tweezers are used to pull the thread tightly against the glue until it sets, and then the excess thread is trimmed away. Here you can see all of the lifeboats have been attached and the threads tensioned correctly, and they add a really nice little bit of detail to that visible area on the upper deck. We can now attach the final piece of rigging, which is slid onto the mast with an overhand knot, but not glued into place just yet as we need to adjust the tension. There are some secondary threads which we need to attach to the upper deck, so some glue is added and then the tweezers used to hold these threads in position until the glue dries. Once everything's tensioned properly, we can add some cyanoacrylate glue and then trim away the excess. With all of the really hard work completed, we can move on to the very last stages, adding a small drop of polycement to the anchors and then gluing one into place on each side at the front of the ship. And then finally, the supplied self-adhesive flags are folded around the masts and threads as shown in the full colour diagrams in the instruction manual. The flags are self-adhesive, so they simply fold around the area where they're attaching, and here you can see we're using the tweezers to pinch them together. And that's it, we've completed the 1:400 scale Airfix Titanic gift set. There's a base supplied with this model, which includes a really nice nameplate, so we can drop the model into place on that, and that's it, we're done. And here you can see the finished model in all its glory. At over 600mm in length, it wouldn't even fit into the light booth that we normally use for our revolving shots at the end of our videos. So if you're going to build this kit at home, just make sure you've got plenty of room to display it when you're finished. In terms of the build itself, it's not that complicated. It's certainly not for beginners, but if you've got a few model kits worth of experience under your belt, then it should be a breeze. And the end result is something that garners a lot of attention and is sure to catch the eye when you display it. So thanks very much for joining us for some modelling today. We hope to see you again in the near future for some more how-to videos. And as always, thanks very much for watching and we'll see you again next time.